Great, thank you. So I'm Kate Gilmartin, and my day job is Chief Executive Officer at the British Hydropower Association. But I'm also a volunteer director with Rosendale Valley Energy and also a volunteer director with Community Energy England. So I've got a renewable energy background, but I've also been working in the community energy space for well over a decade now. So I'm going to talk about our Net Zero Terrace Street project, and it's set up in the corner there, Utility Week Awards finalist. We actually won the award last night, so that was exciting. And this is work we're doing with Electricity Northwest. So basically, this is Rosendale in Lancashire, a very typical village in Lancashire, a deindustrialised mill town, which has considerable fuel poverty, and the housing stock is quite old and inefficient. So yeah, some of the worst housing stock in the UK. Also, 30% of homes are terrace homes, and as Dave said a minute ago, the issue with terrace homes is they don't really have space for an air source heat pump. So we set up Rosendale Valley Energy a couple of years ago now, looking at developing a whole system, one-touch approach to decarbonise terrace communities. And this started through a grant for Community Renewal Fund, and it looked at three different things. It looked at what potential renewable energy projects we could bring forward in terms of community-owned energy generation, and we also looked at how can you decarbonise the terrace streets. And we also looked at finishing off a Grade 1 listed building that was undergoing a full retrofit, and which is now a co-working space, and upstairs are apartments for care leavers. So we think our solution is relevant to 14,000 homes in Rosendale, all of which are in high indices of multiple deprivation areas. We have now got 8.5 full-time equivalent colleagues in the Community Benefit Society. We have volunteer board members, so we have 4 board members who are volunteers and another 2 volunteers as well. And we are solely grant funded. We are on 2 grant funds presently, and they both have funding dates which end next year. So we are working really hard to look at funding streams, but also creating a sustainable business model. So as I said, the problem is you've got a lot of terrace homes. There's actually 6 million 2 to 3 bed terrace homes in the UK. And the thing is about 2 to 3 bed terrace homes is they have a really small footprint, which means that putting an air source heat pump somewhere is going to be difficult, not only from a cost perspective, but from a space constraint. I mean, you can put one in the backyard, but what I always say is, how efficient is that going to be with some bikes propped against it, with some footballs kicked against it, and possibly some leaves sucked up against it as well. So what we're trying to do is create a long-term solution that actually is efficient, but also sustainable in terms of that longevity as well. We've heard quite a bit about centralised heat networks. We did look at what that could look like in this area, and actually there's potential for mine water heating as well, but there isn't, again, like Dave said, there's just not a big heat load, and you really need that anchor heat load to bring forward a centralised heat network, because they're very expensive in terms of development finance. You have to find the land, you have to do the design, you have to get the planning permission, and that's all upfront at risk. And then that's the reason you have the anchor tenant, is to basically underpin your business case, which is much harder to do in domestic setting. So really the only alternative for these terrace homes, and we are seeing this happen with private rented sector, is to put electric boilers in. And it's happening in the private rented because they're cheap to put in, but obviously they're really expensive to run, and they're not great in terms of load on the grid. If you start thinking that these streets on gas are going to go to electric boilers, that's considerable load on the grid at peak time. And again, this work we've been doing with Electricity Northwest is to look at that problem. Also, if you can't put an air source heat pump in, then you're not going to be able to access the boiler upgrade scheme, and you're unlikely to be able to put a ground source heat loop in on your own. So many of these homes are not going to be able to pass through the boiler upgrade scheme and take that grant funding. And we know from the work we've done in the area that there's also a really low uptake of HUGS grants. And this is a problem we've got. The people that actually need it don't actually get the money to enable them to have healthy, warm homes. And obviously the funding that has come through for retrofit is either the able to pay or it's a social housing. And they're doing fantastic work in social housing. They're doing shared ground loops, they're doing decarbonised heat, they're doing fabric retrofit. And really what this project is about is taking that learning and applying it to mixed tenure streets. So we are, we are trying to be the aggregator like a social housing provider would be. And I think the other point as well is that currently there isn't a planned approach for street by street. And what we say is actually, we've seen this happen with broadband. We other areas will get left behind, especially rural areas that already got left behind with broadband. So it's really important from a policy perspective that we speak to government to say, look, these are the people that need it first and fastest, and actually they're currently the ones that are going to get left behind. So also part of the wider problem is obviously energy affordability. Poor quality housing, damp, cold homes leads to poor health outcomes. So a lot of our engagement work has been through health professionals who absolutely get the fact that health and housing are part of the same. Yes, both problems are on the same side of the coin. So, and the spark gap, which is a really big inhibitor for uptake in heat pumps, which is basically that you've got a big differential between the cost of gas and the cost of electricity when you're doing your heating. So what we're saying to government is, this needs to be part of a social programme of change. And often we kind of refer to the fact that, these houses had outside toilets until the 60s and 70s, and in some cases in the 80s. And it was a social programme of change that was brought forward to enable those outside toilets to become indoor toilets because it became socially unacceptable. And we should really push our politicians to say, well, it's socially unacceptable to have cold, damp homes. So we should be able to have affordable energy and healthy, warm homes. Part of obviously our model and part of the issue we've had with retrofit is the issues around the supply chain and the jobs and skills. And we've had a really big issue, going back to the Green Deal, you've had the boom and bust of grants and policy changes, and a lot of people have got their fingers burnt. So what we're trying to do is provide a model that will hopefully get to be non-grant dependent, which will give confidence and certainty to the supply chain that they can see that mobilisation happening without the boom and bust of grant funding. So they can then build their supply chain, their local supply chain, and those local jobs and skills, which we're going to need a lot of. And that's the point is as well, as I've said, it's got to be an investable business model to move us away from grant dependency. So just in terms of the solution, the key is that we are trying to create a standardized, modular, whole systems, one touch, community centric approach. So it kind of does what it says on the tin. And why we're doing this with terrace housing is because generally, all houses are different. It's going to be nuances between terraces on the same street, but we can essentially create a foundational model that means that we can have a standardized modular model, and then we can tweak that accordingly. But also, you've got diversity across that street as well. So basically, that's the general point here is that rather than start with a top-down framework where you've got multiple variables, we're trying to remove as many of those variables as possible by saying what needs to happen in this house and what needs to happen within these streets. So we're looking at obviously fabric retrofit, but we're not doing deep retrofit. We're doing retrofit to bring the heat load of the house down to meet the heat pump, which is a shoebox, Kenza shoebox, 5.8 kilowatt heat pump. And that has to include the repairs as well. So we've got to be able to put solar on roofs and the roofs are fit for purpose. And really it's about creating an optimized building envelope as well, because these houses are essentially going to become part of the energy system for 40 years within this kind of business model. So we're looking at shared ground loops, which are basically 150-metre boreholes that go in the street. And we expect one borehole to have a heat load of about 12 kilowatts, which should be enough to do 2 terraced homes. Obviously, different geology gives different results. 150 metres in one area, it might be 100 in another area, it might be 200 in another area. And essentially those are linked together across a cluster. And that gives you, again, that kind of diversity across that cluster. And they are then obviously linked to a heat pump in the home, smart water cylinder, radiators, pipework, solar panels, And the key is that everything that goes into the house is part of the smart system and becomes part of the smart local energy system. So each home will have a home energy management system, which will control all their smart system and all their smart kit within the house. But then that home energy management system will talk to a community energy management system aggregator, so kind of a cloud-based aggregator. And that will sit next to a digital twin, which sits next to the grid or the transformer at the substation. So essentially what we're trying to do is optimize and balance behind that transformer in terms of where those electrons need to go. So we're not creating constraints upstream of the transformer. And this is the work we're doing that we won the award for last night with Electricity Northwest. And I think a really key point, I don't know whether anybody has looked at the Clean Power 2030 report that was went from NESO, the National Energy Systems Operator, to DESNZ a couple of weeks ago. But they've got two pathways there. One is high renewables and high flex. And within that high flex scenario, they want to see at least 12 gigawatts of demand side flexibility. And what we're saying to them is actually, well, if you decarbonise 6 million terrace homes, that gives you about 12 gigawatts of demand side flexibility, which is enormous. And just comparative, if we were going to do that in pump storage hydro with my day job hat on, that's actually would cost about £30 billion. I've got a bit of background noise there. But I think the point here is that people who can afford the EV, the solar, the storage, and an Octopus Agile tariff, they're paying about 12 pence per kilowatt hour for their energy right now. Whereas the people who can't afford energy are paying about 33 pence per kilowatt hour, and they can't access that kit because of the expense. So what we're trying to do is get that kind of benefit of flexibility, and not just flexibility now in terms of Octopus Agile tariffs, but if we think about how the grid is getting powered by more and more intermittent renewables and why that demand side flexibility is so important, the value of flexibility will go up. So what we're trying to do is try and ring fence the benefit of that future flexibility to return it to the householder. So for now, but also for the future as well. And we've got to overcome this spark gap. So really what we have to do is have that flexibility returned to the householder to overcome that spark gap. We need the economies of scale to overcome that spark gap as well. But we also need a local energy market as well. So we're looking at doing a couple of solar co-ops. We're feeding that generation into the local energy market as well. So how we're working is essentially we are creating demand. So the idea is that we are providing a solution that we want to pull people towards this solution, and we want them, and we talk to them about affordable energy in healthy, warm homes. We call it Net Zero Terrace Street when we're going for funding applications, but actually on the streets, it's just fairer warmth. And it's Rossendale Valley Energy, the Community Benefit Society, that wants to bring affordable energy in healthy, warm homes to Rossendale. So I think that narrative is really important because we know that net zero as a concept can be very divisive. We're working with Centre for Energy Equality, and we've been kind of co-developing the Fairer Warmth app or platform. And really that's a customer relationship management system. And it's there for people to download, and it gives energy advice, but it also is there to collect data as well. So we can get people to upload their energy data, and then we can also get them to ask for an energy assessment, and we can then put in the U values, etc., into the Fairer Warmth app. And that kind of pulls through the data. It starts off with, either parity data or EPC data. And basically we improve the granularity of that data through our energy champions, through people putting that data into the app. And that feeds through to a building energy model, which feeds into a techno-economic model, which feeds into a financial model. And the key is that we want this to be an investable proposition. So the quality of the data and the confidence within that data is really key to create that investable model. This has to be at no upfront cost to householders. So we're basically pinning the debt onto the infrastructure. So the debt of the fabric retrofit and the smart system all sits on the borehole, and it's wrapped up into a single standing charge, which is part of your connection agreement. The key is that it is a community-based model where the asset ownership is within the community ownership as well. And that's really important for a number of reasons. But fundamentally, people have to trust that this is for them, and they have ownership of it. I think we've got our fingers burnt in terms of our assets in the UK being sold on, the water industry, etc., and our bills going up. And we have to say to people that their bill isn't going to go up by 600%, like the water industry, for example. So it has to be a kind of community-based, non-profit extractive model. And again, that's really important in terms of the spark gap as well. It's got to be a deep trust model. And where we want to get to is to have stable annualized bills. So really kind of insulating people from the energy crisis that we had in 2022, and giving people certainty over their bills. So ideally what we'd like to do is have a monthly stable bill. So you're not paying more in winter than you are in summer, for example. But that at the moment, that's not in our business model. It's just something that we aspire to. I think I'm kind of said about the investable business model. I mean, essentially what we're creating is a new infrastructure asset class, and it's buried, therefore it's safe. So anything that goes in the house is owned by the householder, including the solar. But obviously the infrastructure in the street is owned through a community model, but basically we are getting asset infrastructure funding for that. That's the plan. There will be iterations of our business model until we get to non-grant dependency. At the moment, our financial model states that we have about a project IRR of 1.5% to 2%, which obviously isn't going to get the pension funds out of bed. But we need to have injection of grant funding, stroke subsidy, and even we're looking at tapered subsidy to talk to Treasury and government to say this is what it's going to cost, but this is how it tapers, and this is what the end product is. We've got to obviously build the confidence, as I said, in the supply chain. We've got to avoid that boom and bust of grants. We've got to get the economies of scale. And also we're being very prescriptive to government in terms of what we need from them to unlock this market. And what we're saying at the moment is, there are options for people who are able to pay, able to play. But at the moment, there are no options really for people in these streets that haven't got the finance, haven't got the space, and currently they're locked out of that transition. These are just kind of the moving parts. So I won't go to this diagram, but it's just to try and highlight that we've got, kind of the physical infrastructure is all wrapped up over here in the green. So that's basically everything that goes in the house, the retrofit and the boreholes. And then underneath here is how you have to create the demand for the solution, because it doesn't matter how good your solution is. If people don't want it, then we're not going to get anywhere. So it's how we do that with our community champions, with the Fairer Warmth app, building our reputation, the energy advice we're giving. Over on the right, you've got what we call the virtual infrastructure. So that's all the smart system and how that integrates across the houses and then interfaces with the grid. In the middle is all the organisational governance, and that's what we're really working on in the Pathfinder 2 project, which is through Net Zero Living. How everything sits together, hangs together, is contracted, where the data flows are, where the GDPR needs to sit. And then all this kind of flows up to the top into the energy model, and then into the techno-economic model, the financial model, which is obviously where we have to get the investment. So those are kind of the moving parts of the puzzle, which we have to get them all nailed down to actually deliver a replicable, scalable model. And the whole point is that we do want this to replicate and scale. So there's lots of things that we can share as outputs from things like our Pathfinder 2 project. So our DNO planning tool, the smart system, the service model. So all those things are things that we're working on now, with the intention that we can work with other communities through kind of a social franchise, because the key is that this has to be a community-centric model. We don't think that it's commercial enough to be picked up and run with by the big boys, but fundamental to the work we're doing is to pass it on to other community groups that have the same ethos as us in terms of that asset ownership and the community and the non-profit extractive model. So yes, what's next? So as I said, we're doing 2 projects. We've got the Pathfinder 2 Net Zero Living, that's doing a 3-house demonstrator, but it's building all those kind of outputs in terms of the procurement methodology, the operational governance, the templates, the legal templates, the MOUs, the techno-economic model. So we're just improving the package with all these outputs in, and that runs till November next year. And then we've been working with Electricity Northwest, and that's on all the virtual infrastructure, on the smart stuff. And we've done a strategic innovation fund discovery, and then we moved on to Alpha, and we're just about to start an NIA, which is the Network Innovation Allowance project with ENWL. And that's working on this kind of operability of the kit with the home energy management system. And then we'll look to do an application for strategic innovation fund beta in spring next year. And that will be where the home energy management system communicates and interfaces with the community energy management system and the network. So that's a really interesting piece of work that's going on there at the moment. But we want to do 200 homes, and we need to find pilot funding to do 200 homes, but do it in a way that's really sandbox. So actually looking at, working with the universities to look at, well, what is the social impact? What's the improvements in air quality? What could the economic multiplier be? So that's our job now, is to try and find funding for 200 homes. And we're asking government to continue to support the work we're doing. So we've got another fund, which is the DESNZ Local Energy Advice Demonstrator, and that runs out in March. So that's funding 4 of our members of staff at the moment. And what they're doing, as I mentioned earlier, is they're working with health professionals, and that's been really successful, building those relationships with the health professionals and working through their networks to reach people who are vulnerable or who need healthy, warm homes. We're saying to government, okay, well, the Net Zero Living finishes, it's an innovation project, it finishes next November. Where do we go now? Because we've got a lot of knowledge that we want to share, but we need to have the kind of runway funding to make sure that knowledge doesn't dissipate, because people have got to work and they need to find jobs. So we're really talking to government about how do we create this to be a standardized, replicable, scalable model. And how do we streamline the processes? So how can other groups pick up what we're doing, but have the same conversations with investors? So basically matching things like our quality assurance process, and making sure that from a due diligence perspective, investors see housing in Brighton and Toxteth and Bacup and Bridgend, and they can look at that and aggregate their investment across that kind of portfolio of houses. And obviously policy engagement as well. So it's really critical. I think what we're trying to do is uncover the really nitty-gritty issues. So this isn't about concept. It's about actually how do you do this, and what are the assessments processes? I mean, at the moment, because everything's geared towards deep retrofit and things like PAS 2035, it costs thousands of pounds to do assessments on terrace housing, and you just can't scale that up. So we're creating a net zero terrace standard with our rationale for why we're doing what we're doing. And also we're trying to create this kind of local development order for terrace housing. So for example, if you want to put external wall insulation on a terrace gable end, it goes outside the red line boundary, and therefore you have to apply for planning permission as if you were doing an extension. And if you want to do a borehole next to a sewer pipe, there needs to be a 3-metre buffer. So we're unpicking all these problems and saying, okay, well, here's a solution, here's the rationale for that solution, how can we wrap this up? So we're working with Rosendale Borough Council on what that looks like in terms of a suggested local development order that would mop up all these issues to mean that we can streamline and move through faster. And also, yes, I think I said already about the how we can look at policy, things like aggregating the boiler upgrade scheme. For those people that can't do it individually, then can we just aggregate that? Obviously, the Warm Homes Plan coming out as well, so we're really interested to see how that can be applied to area-based retrofit programs. So yeah, I think that's pretty much everything. So yes, it's about what I say as well to government is, people generally don't care about decarbonising the grid by 2030, which is obviously the government's ambition and the whole point of the Clean Power 2030, etc., etc. But people really do care about having affordable energy and healthy, warm homes and be able to afford their energy bill and not getting a shock. So we've got to flip that narrative, and net zero has to be about people in their homes being comfortable. And it just so happens we're also decarbonising heat, undertaking fabric retrofit, and ensuring that the domestic, demand side flexibility is going to get to people who need it first and fastest. I think as well, it's a key to building resilience within communities. So, the key is here that you're not leaving people behind, and you're trying to create a new social norm. So as it's a bit like broadband, there's going to be early adopters and laggards, but it's become a social norm that people have broadband and they want it and they use it. So we've got to kind of create this new social norm in terms of decarbonised heat as well. And yeah, things like the local power plan have to be a whole system solution, not just generation. It's got to be how it all fits together at that local level. And as I think I've said that, this is about a bread and butter issue. And, Labour should be really focused on the fact that if they want people to be able to afford energy, which is a real bread and butter issue, they have to look at these types of solutions to deliver at scale. Yeah, because if people don't, people have to actively see and benefit from the energy transition. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. I think that's me. Yeah, that's my contact details. And thank you very much for the invite, Philip.